Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this week's PAVE panel on the topic of empowering consumers to rise to the automation challenge. My name is Tabitha Coulter, and I'm PAVE's Director of Operations and your moderator for today's panel. We have three fantastic guests today that I'm going to introduce, and then we'll get into the conversation. First, we have John Lenneman, Senior Principal Research Scientist at Toyota's Collaborative Safety Research Center. John, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
Next, we have Amy Bucher. Bucher, VP of Behavior Change Design at MadPow. Amy, great to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
And third, we have Jim Jenness, Associate Director of Technology and Safety Research at Westat. Jim, great to have you rounding out this trio.
Hey, thank you.
Sure. And rather than kind of jumping straight into questions, for this one, we're going to start by giving each of our panelists a few minutes to sort of explain their research and their background that they're bringing into this conversation. So Jim, we'll start with you, then we'll move on to John and Amy.
Thanks, Tabitha. I'm excited to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I work at Westat, which is in Rockville, Maryland, and we're primarily a research company that works for federal government and OEMs and states and other nonprofit agencies. But we did a recent project for the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety that I wanted to talk a little bit about today because I think it's very relevant to this topic of consumer education. And the report on this project is called Impact of Information on Consumer Understanding of a Partially Automated Driving System. And it's co-authored with my colleague Jerry Singer, who was the leader of this project, and it's up now on the website for the AAA Foundation. So you can go get the real information there, and if I say something wrong, you can come back to me and say, oh, you screwed it all up. But it's a really interesting study because what we did is we looked at the subtle effects that can happen when you're trying to provide consumers information about automated driving technology. And so it was a true experiment that we set up. So we recruited 90 participants who had no previous experience driving a vehicle with level 2 automation. And we exposed them to a vehicle with level 2 automation. But what we did was we manipulated the information that we gave them about the system in very subtle ways. So every participant in the study got the same information about the kind of capabilities and limitations of the system and the driver's responsibilities when you're using the system. However, we sort of had two kind of marketing approaches or branding approaches to the information. And then we also had three different modes of training modes. And so we looked at all 6 of those conditions in this experiment. And so the 2 different branding conditions I think are the most interesting difference because we saw the most interesting differences in the data with those. And so in one case, we called the system Autono Drive, which emphasized the capabilities of the system, and it lets people be more relaxed while they're driving and stuff like that. The advantages of it, basically. And then the other system we called Drive Assist, and that one emphasized more about kind of the limitations and the driver's responsibility, and that it's a good system, but you have to pay attention, stuff like that. Now, what's important to say is that the basic information that we provided to all participants was the same. So everybody actually did have information about limitations of the systems and the driver's responsibility. It was just the emphasis that we put on the information, and of course the name that we gave to the system. And what we found is that so what we did is we trained them according to one of these 6 different cells. And so it was either people got the Autono Drive condition or the Drive Assist condition. And then they got one of 3 training modes. They could have gotten an in-person demo from a researcher, but it was sort of like a sales person kind of a demo. Or they watched a video, sort of like a YouTube video about a new technology. Or in the third case, they had a quick start guide that we created. And they went out and we gave them the training, and then we gave them a questionnaire that asked them about their understanding of the how the system might work in different situations. And what we found is that in a lot of these situations were situations that actually the system would not, it would be out of the operational design domain for the system. Okay, so but what we found is that the people who had the more aggressive marketing approach, the AutonoDrive system, they had much more confidence in the system. They thought it would work in many more situations, and they were much more willing to say that they would do things while using the system, like use a handheld cell phone or be eating or things like that. And then and we also then, after we gave them that questionnaire, we took them out on the road to observe their behavior actually using the system. And in that case, we measured things like their hands off the wheel time and their feet off the pedals time. And again, we saw that there were significant differences between the AutonoDrive condition and the drive assist condition. Then we brought them back to back to the lab and asked them more questions, and some of the same questions that we asked them before the drive, because we wanted to see that, you know, if there are these effects, these subtle effects of the consumer information, do those go away? Like once you have experience actually driving the vehicle, maybe those kind of effects just go away, right? But what we found is no, actually they persist. And in some cases, we have a little bit of evidence that there might even been sort of a magnifying effect where the people who got the AutonoDrive, after they experienced driving the vehicle themselves, their confidence went even higher for what the system could do. So it's a very interesting study. And we also looked at those effects of mode. So like in-person training versus a quick start guide versus a video, like a YouTube video. And the results that we got for that were less. We didn't find as many interesting differences between modes, so I'm not gonna talk about that in the interest of time. But if you go to the AAA Foundation website, you can read all about the stuff that we did.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. That's really interesting. John, do you want to give us a little intro to your work, your research?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Interestingly, it's some work that we did with Jim at Westat, and it's a project where we investigated mental models associated with ADAS or automated driving technologies. A mental model is, maybe we'll say it's a term that basically says how does one understand a system and an operation of a system, right? And so what we were trying to do in this project was really try to understand what is the initial evolution of or initial formation of the mental model associated with ADAS technologies, and then how does that mental model evolve over time as people experience the technology and as they get to know it over a course of 3 to 6 months. And then we think that with these findings that I'll discuss and some of the insights that I'll present can be applied in 2 ways. First is in design. Ideally, we want to make the technologies as intuitive as possible. But to the extent that they're not, we can then design consumer education programs that will accompany the release of future technologies. And we want those to be as efficient as possible. So, and as effective as possible. So what was the study? You know, it was an on-road study where we pulled in people that had at least 2 ADAS technologies. They tended to be one with a lateral control system, one with a longitudinal control system. We had about 54 people come in, and we basically interviewed them every 2 weeks from beginning to end over the course of 3 to 6 months. For a small sample, I think about 12 people of the 54, we did more than just interview them. We actually integrated sensors, accelerometers, gyroscopes, GPS tracking systems, so we could get speed and that type of stuff and location. So we could actually observe driving behavior, integrated cameras as well. I'm not going to review that here. I'm just going to really talk about the interview data that we collected and how that informed our learnings with regard to the mental models. So during the interviews, the initial interview, for example, we collected a lot of data about driving behavior using the IQ, one's sensation-seeking sort of tendencies using the Hoyle sensation-seeking scale. One's locus of control. Are they introverts, extroverts? Do they feel like the world imposes things on them, or do they have control using Rotter's locus of control? We also had questions about technology acceptance. And then we had a whole series of questions just about trust, acceptance, et cetera, those types of questions. When we asked those questions initially, and then related questions in a very structured interview, every 2 weeks, up to 3 to 6 months. Some subjects lasted about 3 months, others lasted about 6 months in the study. Another thing that we did was we looked at the interviews. I should say the team at Westat looked at the interviews and had multiple raters sort of judge their responses and the information that the subjects were providing according to a number of different dimensions. And they were things like mental model complexity. How complex did they think the mental model that these people had, how complex was it? We had criteria to judge that. Accuracy of the technology understanding, what did the technology entail from a technical perspective, what types of sensors, that type of stuff. Functional accuracy of the capabilities or of the technology, what was it intended to do? We actually judged emotional availance towards the technologies. So did people tend to be more positive or negative? And then levels of sort of anthropomorphic attributes or mechanical attributes towards the technology. Did people tend to think of it more like a human or more like a machine? And then finally, we asked them to just describe their technology using a set of analog descriptors that they could choose from. And so some of these analog descriptors were things like, they consider it an assistant, or did they consider it a partner or an honest friend or a teacher or an 83-year-old aunt in the back seat nagging at you, those types of things, a toolkit or a robot. And then we put all this data, did a number of different analyses. We did the two I'm going to focus on are some of our correlation analyses and our cluster analyses. And the output of those, I'm going to present or discuss in sort of 3 insights here. The first insight we sort of gleaned from this analysis was that emotion is very important in developing trust and acceptance and eventually utilization of a technology. And that's not really new when you think about how important emotion is in things like even purchasing decisions, right? So emotion is very important in a lot of the decisions we make and even how we process information. So a lot of the information that we process with regard that and we use to form our mental models is mediated through emotion. The other insight that we had was that there's quite a significant relationship between driving behavior and mental models. And simply put, we saw that better drivers tended to have better mental models. And then the third insight we found we had was a result of the cluster analysis, where we saw essentially that there were 5 types of learners. And actually we'll say 3 types of learners, and one of them is broken up into 3 levels. There's learners who they have the ability to learn and they already had some sort of knowledge about the technology, right? And so when we classified those into expert learners, skilled learners, and moderate level learners. Then there are learners who they have an ability to learn, but they didn't really know anything about the technology to begin with. But over time, they will learn about the technologies. Okay, those are 4 learner types that we think we can work with. The interesting cluster group here is what we call misinformed learners. And these are people who think they know something about the technology, and they sure are confident in their own knowledge about the technology, but their knowledge is pretty inaccurate. Interestingly, is they also don't want to learn more about the technology, and they don't want to use the systems for the most part, right? So that's a big roadblock, and it's basically, we think that's the big challenge in consumer education. And that's about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. Amy, could you give us a rundown of your area?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for a company called MadPower, a strategic design consultancy based in the Boston and Portsmouth, New Hampshire areas. And we work quite a bit in automotive, but also more broadly in health and safety behaviors. So I'm the Vice President of Behavior Change Design. And in my role, I'm applying behavior change frameworks and models to do the research to understand how people engage in particular behaviors, and then help design interventions that get them toward what we call target behaviors, the things that we would like them to be doing. So as Jim and John were talking, one of the models that I want to briefly touch on that we use a lot in our work and I think is incredibly relevant here is called the COM-B model of behavior change. It's a simple acronym, COM-B, and the B stands for behavior. So we define the behaviors that we'd like to see people take. And in this case, it's use of the ADAS technology, appropriate use of it. And we might break that down into even more granular sub-behaviors. But once we have that target behavior in mind, we want to analyze what's going on that might be preventing people from doing it effectively, or that might already be helping them do it. Because as we think about designing an intervention or creating an educational approach, we're going to want to combat those barriers, right? We're going to want to design something that targets those barriers or takes advantage of the things in the environment that are already working in our favor. So the barriers can be classed in the C, the O, and the M. It's capability, opportunity, and motivation. And capability is one that's very, very relevant for this topic because it's broken down into both physical capability and psychological capability, basically your knowledge. Do you understand how this works? And as you might imagine, education is one of the most effective tools that we have to combat barriers that fall into that psychological capability bucket. But as John just mentioned, another thing that we often see in our research is there are people who don't have good psychological capability. They have misunderstandings or false beliefs, false knowledge, but they also believe that they do know how to do things properly. And so that falls into the M, the motivation. And the O is opportunity. I'm not going to talk as much about that. That's really about the environment in which a behavior takes place, both the physical and the social environment. But the motivation, the M, that's broken down into two pieces that are also extremely relevant here. So one of them is your reflective motivation. And that's kind of the way we talk about it day-to-day life, the goals and the priorities that you have and the things that you think are important. And so one of the opportunities we have here with education is to help people understand how using these technologies can support other goals they have in their lives. Things like staying safe and being efficient and recognizing economic returns, if they're using less gas and being more efficient with their driving behaviors. The other one is automatic motivation, and this is the mental models piece. This is people's understanding of how the world works. And oftentimes, people aren't able to reflect on that explicitly. It's something that is kind of built into our own systems as we grow up in a society and a way of behaving. So it can be difficult to interrogate, but as we research, we will sometimes discover, to John's point, that people will have these mental models about how something works that are really hindering them from behaving in a way that we think that they should be behaving. And so the role of our education in that place comes to be to disrupt those mental models. How do we present information in a novel way that grabs people's attention and piques their curiosities so that they don't put up this resistance to hearing something that's different from what they already believe? I have some examples of doing that and also how to move these different levers in concert to help get people to change their behaviors. But I know that this is a relatively short session and we have a lot of questions. So I think I want to pause there and kind of dive into the question area, if that's all right.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Amy, so much. You did a great segue into what I think we want to talk about next, which is, obviously PAVE is an educational organization, so that's sort of our mission. So I kind of wanted to broadly start out based on the research that you all have kind of discussed so far, like what do you see as the biggest educational challenges in terms of ADAS and automated vehicles, and what kind of should we prioritize when we think about that?
So I'll start, and I think the biggest challenge with regard to education is we're trying to come up with solutions for a population where there's just a ton of variability in the cognitive, perceptual, motor capabilities, right? And so there's not going to be a one size fits all type of solution. And so I think the future really requires some sort of like customization and personalization. But that's really difficult work. People throw those words around a lot, right? But it's really difficult. But the good news is I think, now, 10, 20 years ago when people talked about adaptive technologies, maybe it was a little bit more pie in the sky. But now we have the tools, machine learning, AI tools, and even more, we have a ton of data. And when you combine the tools with the data, maybe now the time is right, to actually create these sort of customized, personalized approaches to accommodate the large variation in the populations that we actually have.
I love that answer, and it dovetails really nicely with the behavior change approach that I take. I mentioned a little bit this idea of motivation and aligning what we're asking people to do with the things that they care about. Personalization is an incredible tool to do that. And one of the really nice things is that, human beings have a lot in common as much as we're all really different. And so there are a limited set of values and goals that people are bringing to this driving experience that we can use as the basis for how we personalize. And with the data, with the machine learning and the other capabilities that we have present, we have the opportunity to provide people with ongoing feedback as they drive that helps reinforce that they're supporting those goals. And that's kind of another point that I think is important, that we need to not think of education as a one-time event. It isn't just that you receive a lesson or watch a video and that's it. People are constantly learning as they accommodate new information from their behavior and their environment. And so we need to think about the feedback mechanisms of the technology as an ongoing educational experience that we can craft to help support people in those behaviors.
Absolutely. Jim, do you have anything to add there?
No, I would just second what John said about the tremendous variability between people. I think that's right on, and also I agree completely with Amy as well. I think that education's not a one point in time thing. We had the study that John was talking about that we did at Westat for 6 months. People were still learning new things out at 5 and 6 months. They're still learning new things about their technology, and so I think that there's a lot of opportunity for in-vehicle support for that.
Yeah, and so I'd just like to add, I think what that screams is, I think we need to take an approach to consumer education. It's not like a study or studies are not going to solve the problem. It's a dedicated research program. So that's necessary to address the consumer education issues.
Absolutely. Amy, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but when we think about educating the public about automated driving, it kind of seems like this totally unique challenge, and how will we get through it? But I know that there are aspects of this challenge that are comparable to other areas where we have seen education be successful. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's one that I really like to use because I think it's one of the best examples that we have societally of large-scale education that ultimately shifted behaviors. And it surprises people because I think our perceptions of this are a little off from the data, but smoking cessation. So if you look back in the 1950s and 60s, a really enormous proportion of the American public smoked cigarettes. Yeah. And then in 1964, the US Surgeon General published the first report about cigarette smoking and its ill effects on health. And even though people kind of knew that smoking wasn't great for you, this was the first time it was really codified and put forward by an official. And if you look at the rate of smoking in America around that time, it has a sharp downturn right away, just from education, putting this information out there in a credible and collated format. But of course, a lot of people still smoked. If you look at current day stats, it's down a lot. It's something like 10% of Americans overall smoke cigarettes. And there are three kind of big categories of levers that have worked in concert to make that happen. So the first one, as I mentioned, is that education. It set the background for it's really the tipping point where we started to see the smoking rate drop off. And the point I would make is that education is a necessary but insufficient component to lasting behavior change many times. It's, knowing is not necessarily enough to get into the doing. But the two other pieces with smoking that I think have applicability here is that there was also over time a policy and regulation shift. So we see that things like tax rates on cigarettes and being allowed to smoke in a public place, those have really affected the behavior. And as we see norms around the way different types of vehicles are taxed and regulated and put on the market, I think we'll start to see some of that pressure as well. And then the third piece is individual behavior change. So even though we have this education out there and cigarettes are expensive, there are still people who struggle with tobacco addiction. And we have a pretty well-formed arsenal of tactics that we can use to help any individual basically analyze their individual smoking habit and overcome it over time with multiple different strategies. And I think, again, here, this is where that personalized approach might come in with automated driving. As we start to understand what a particular person's barriers are, we can craft our approach to help overcome them. So I think smoking cessation is actually a really nice parallel in terms of thinking about the problem from multiple angles to produce a large scale shift in behavior.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thinking too about that consumer education more broadly, I'm curious, like, where should that be taking place? Do you know, should that be at the dealership, in the vehicle itself? Should it be part of driver licensing tests? Sort of, where do you all see that conversation taking place the most? Jim, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it might be all of the above, honestly. I mean, we've also done some studies where we've done some secret shopping at dealerships, and those are really fun to do. And I think that certainly dealers have some responsibility for consumer education for sure. And in the study that John was talking about, which is a different study, we asked people where they got their information from about their, and a lot of people reported really positive experiences about the dealership and about learning about things at the dealership. But I don't think that's the answer. I think, I think the manufacturers could do more in the vehicle, kind of contextual help kind of stuff. And also interface design stuff that makes functionality more apparent, transparent.
Mhm. And I just like to add, yeah, it depends, right? I think that's what the theme is here. And we mentioned customization earlier, right? But I talked about it from an individual perspective, so you're customizing to the individual, but maybe it depends on the technology. Maybe certain technologies are better taught in a dealership, and maybe certain technologies are better experienced and integrated actually on the road. And so it might be a technology dependent sort of an issue. It also depends on how well we're able to train dealers. That's one thing to consider too, is it's not just about educating users. If we say that we're going to educate users in the dealership, then essentially we need to educate the dealers or the service technicians or whoever is responsible for that in the dealership as well.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, some of the work that I've done with construction safety, which again, I think has a lot of parallels here, we've discovered that virtual reality can be a really useful tool for some of this training, where there are certain behaviors that are best learned in practice, like you go and you do them and that's how you learn them. But if there's a risk associated with it, then virtual reality provides a safe environment to get that experiential education without necessarily putting yourself at the same level of risk. And, I think it's just a cool and engaging technology as well. So you could think about something like a dealership experience where somebody comes in and gets to engage with the technology in a totally safe environment, builds up some of that confidence and knowledge to then take it on the road. I think that that could be a cool opportunity to explore.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. So kind of we're getting near the end of time. So I want to kind of end on really focusing in on like what consumers can experience on the road today. So looking more at kind of like advanced driver systems rather than, we talked a little about things at higher levels of automation, but kind of looking at what people might be able to expect today. I'm curious how we can kind of address some of those challenges. Is that by making those ADAS features and interfaces more intuitive, or formal education? But kind of when we think about that area, which I know you guys have all done research in, what can help the most there? John?
Well, I mean, so the ultimate goal is to make a technology as intuitive as possible, right? I mean, that's what we want to do. But as technologies get more complex, right, and because of the broad range, we've hit that home, in terms of capabilities of our users, customers, it's really tough. So I think, what we need to do is, prioritize, really look at what the roadmap is, the technologies that are coming out. But not just that, we need to have some sort of vision to how is the user base going to expand? So as we add more technologies to the vehicle, how many more people are going to benefit from sort of a more inclusive mobility society? And with that, we need to understand, are there any sort of differences in cognitive, perceptual, motoric capabilities that we may need to understand with that increased base and capture that in our consumer education program? So I'm sorry I didn't answer your question, please, but that's a point.
I think that's
I had one other
Jim,
comment
Amy, do
about
either
it.
of you guys have
I
something
think that as whatever the consumer education approach is developed, I think there needs to be just more kind of testing, because I think that sometimes the message that's being sent might not be completely the message that was intended in the design of the education. And I think people might be, you know, picking up or misinterpreting things or picking up things that weren't necessarily intended. So even though everyone has good intentions, you know, if there's not like really good cognitive testing done on these things, I think people might have to misunderstand. And then the other thing, I think there's competing priorities, right? So like the marketing folks want to really sell stuff, and you know, which I understand. But I think that sometimes if things are overhyped, that can also lead to a kind of a decrease in customer satisfaction over time. So I think there's a good reason to sort of make sure that all the educational materials are really kind of accurate.
And I would just add, in terms of our own mental models working on this technology, that we shouldn't decouple the design and how intuitive it is from the education, because really, as I mentioned before, you know, people are learning on the job, so to speak. And so we have opportunities to create a design in a way that provides that ongoing education and training. So I would just say, I try not to think of them separately so that that can happen more.
Thank you so much. I would love to talk to you guys all day, but I know we all have schedules and things to get to. So I just wanted to say thank you to you all for, you know, taking the time to be here. This has been really fascinating. I hope the audience has gotten as much out of it. And I did want to send a kind of quick reminder to the audience that when we sent the email reminder today about this, we included some of the resources, the research that like John and Jim were talking about today. So please be sure to check those out if this is a topic that is really interesting to you, or feel free to head over to PAVE's resource library on our website and kind of dive deeper into these conversations. We barely scratched the surface in these 30 minutes, so let us know, contact us if you want to, you know, kind of any more information on that. Anyways, Amy, John, Jim, thank you so much for everything, and it was great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.